floor cracked under 6 times standard gravity, and I was the only one in the control room who understood what that sound meant. Glass, not metal. The reinforced plating on Deck 4 was rated for 8 times gravity without strain. It should not have made a sound like that. I pressed my hand flat against the console and watched the readout climb past the safety threshold, past the line we had drawn in red ink during the planning meetings, past every number I had personally signed off on. Inside the chamber, Grace Bellamy was still standing. She should not have been standing. At 4 times gravity, most recruits from soft worlds are on their knees, spitting blood from burst vessels in their gums. At 5 times, most of them stop moving altogether. We had never taken a live cadet past 5.5, not once, in 11 years of running this program. The counter on my screen read 6.1. My name is Elena Hart. I am the staff xenobiologist assigned to Cadet Evaluation and Oversight, Station Halcyon Reach, on the edge of a border system nobody important cares about. I have spent 19 years cataloging the tolerances of every species that walks, crawls, or drifts through this station's corridors. I know how much pressure a Velcaran skeleton can take before it folds. I know the exact temperature at which a Sethi loses consciousness. I have never, not once, had a species break my instruments simply by refusing to fall down. Commander Owen Blake stood behind me, with his arms crossed, watching the same numbers I was watching, saying nothing. That silence told me more than any alarm could have. 6.3. Grace lifted one boot, set it down, lifted the other. She was walking. I want to be honest about what happened in my chest in that moment, because honesty is the only thing I have left to offer anyone at this point in the story. It was not admiration. Admiration comes later, when you have time to sit with something and turn it over and decide how you feel about it. What I felt, watching a human cadet take a single step at 6 times her homeworld's gravity, was the particular cold that comes from realizing your instruments are lying to you, and they are not the ones at fault. I had built my entire career on the assumption that biology has limits, that every species, no matter how strange, no matter how resilient, eventually meets a wall it cannot climb over. I had written papers on this. I had taught seminars on this. I had used the phrase load-bearing failure point so many times it had stopped meaning anything to me, the way any word does when you say it enough. Grace Bellamy was, according to every paper I had ever written, currently experiencing a load-bearing failure point. She kept walking. "Pull her out," I said. Owen didn't move. She's within her own safety parameters. She's within nobody's safety parameters. I wrote those parameters. She adjusted them. This morning. Filed the paperwork herself. He tapped his own screen, and a form appeared. Cadet authored, Cadet signed, requesting an increase to the day's gravity ceiling, on the grounds that the previous ceiling was, in her words, not doing anything. I stared at that word for a long time. Anything. 6.4. In the chamber, Grace reached the far wall, pressed her palm against it the way you might check if a stove is hot, curious rather than cautious. Then she turned around and started walking back. That was the first day I understood I did not know what I was looking at. It would not be the last. I had read her file before she ever set foot on the station. Every cadet's file crosses my desk before their first week is out. A formality mostly. A box to check. Homeworld, designated a Category 9 environment, the highest hostility rating our classification system allows. Category 9 worlds are not places we send research teams. They are places we send probes, and sometimes not even those, because the insurance costs more than the data is worth. Grace's homeworld sits at 1.4 times standard gravity, which on its own would earn a Category 4 rating and nothing more. Gravity alone doesn't make a world dangerous, it's the rest of it. A magnetic field that fails on a rotating schedule nobody has fully mapped, exposing the surface to radiation storms for hours at a time, several times a year, in patterns the locals have learned to predict the way other species predict rain. An ecosystem where the apex predators are not the largest animals but the smallest, because evolution on that world rewarded speed and venom over size. Weather systems capable of stripping paint from stone. A history of the local population fighting each other with a persistence that outlasted every other conflict record in our database, century after century, war after war, as if peace itself were the anomaly, and violence the baseline condition of their species. I remember reading the geological survey and thinking, not for the first time, that this was a world that should not have produced anything capable of leaving it. And yet here she was, 26 years old, 5'7", a build that would look unremarkable in any crowd on any peaceful colony world in the sector. Nothing about her physical presentation suggested what her file contained. That was the first thing that unsettled me, if I am tracking the unsettling things in order. Every dangerous species I had ever studied wore its danger somewhere visible. Claws, plating, the particular stillness of something that has learned killing is efficient. Grace Bellamy smiled at the intake officer on her first day and asked where she could get something to eat, and nothing in her posture, her voice, or her file photo suggested she came from a world where six-legged nocturnal hunters could clear 100 meters in under 4 seconds. I met her in person on day 3, standard procedure. A biologist sits down with every Deathworld classified cadet before training begins, runs a baseline physical, asks a list of questions designed to catch anything the paperwork missed. She sat across from me in the exam room, swinging her legs slightly off the edge of the table, like someone waiting for a bus, rather than someone about to begin 900 hours of gravity conditioning, designed to break cadets who could not adapt. "So," she said, "what's the record? For this program, just so I know what I'm working toward." "There isn't a record for graduating early," I told her. "The program is fixed length, 900 hours, regardless of performance." Huh. She considered this the way someone considers a mildly disappointing restaurant menu. "Okay, what's the record for the highest gravity tolerance logged during the program then?" I checked the file. 5.5. A Velkaran cadet, 6 years ago. Their species has reinforced skeletal density as a baseline trait. "Right." She nodded slowly, filing the number away somewhere behind her eyes. "And what happens after 5.5? Biologically? What's the actual failure mode?" I explained it the way I would explain it to any cadet, because at that point, I had no reason to explain it differently. Cardiovascular strain first. In most species, the heart working harder than it was built to work, blood pooling where it should not pool, vision narrowing before consciousness follows it out the door, skeletal stress next, for species without reinforced density, microfractures accumulating faster than the body can repair them, respiratory collapse in edge cases, the diaphragm no longer strong enough to do its one job. Grace listened to all of this with the focused attention of someone taking notes for an exam she intended to pass with a perfect score. "Okay," she said when I finished. "So basically, my body's going to try to convince me it's dying, and I need to figure out which parts of that are real, and which parts are just, like opinions." I did not have a good answer for that sentence. I still don't, fully, though I have had a long time to think about it since. "That's a reasonable summary," I admitted, because it was, technically, correct, even though nothing about the way she said it matched how a body actually experiences its own limits being tested. She hopped down off the table. "Cool. When do we start?" "Tomorrow, 0600. "Great." She was already walking toward the door, already thinking about something else, some private calculation running behind her expression that I would not understand for another 400 hours. At the door she paused, turned halfway back. "Hey, quick question. Is there a rule against doing extra sessions? Like, off the clock?" I told her there was no rule against it, mostly because the possibility had never come up before. Cadets did not request additional exposure to conditions specifically designed to hurt them. This was not a category of behavior my training had prepared me to anticipate. "Cool," she said again, and left, and I sat alone in the exam room for a long moment, doing something I rarely do during working hours, which was nothing at all. Just sitting, turning the conversation over, trying to locate the part of it that should have alarmed me, and finding, instead, that every part of it did. The first 200 hours went the way the charts said they should go, mostly. Grace's body responded to escalating gravity, the way any competent, healthy human body responds. Elevated heart rate, increased respiratory effort, the visible strain of muscles working against a force actively trying to fold her toward the floor. I watched the readouts and felt something loosen in my chest that I had not realized was tight. This is normal, I remember thinking. This is a normal cadet having a normal, difficult experience. My earlier unease had been an overreaction. Professionals are allowed to be wrong about first impressions. I filed my Day 2 notes with something close to relief. Hour 212 is when the relief started to curdle. I was reviewing the automated logs, the kind of routine data sweep I do at the end of every week, mostly to catch equipment drift before it becomes a real problem. Grace's file showed something odd in the margin of the data. Additional session entries. Timestamps outside her scheduled window. I pulled the full log. She had been coming in early. Not by a few minutes. By hours. The scheduled training block ran 4 hours a day, 6 days a week, gravity increasing in small increments as her body adjusted. According to the equipment logs, Grace had been arriving 2 hours before her scheduled block and staying 1 hour after it, every single day, for the past week and a half. Nobody had approved this. I found Owen in his office and put the log in front of him without preamble. He looked at it for a long moment. She filed the requests through the training terminal directly. Automated approval system. It didn't flag for human review because the increments were within daily safety limits. The increments were within daily safety limits for a single session. She was running 3. I know. He rubbed his eyes. I found the same thing an hour ago. I was about to come find you. We sat with that for a moment, the two of us, in the particular silence that happens when two professionals realize a system they both trusted has a hole in it neither of them noticed, until something fell through. Why, I said, finally, would anyone do this to themselves voluntarily? Owen didn't answer, because there wasn't an answer built out of anything either of us knew yet. I called Grace into my office the next morning. She arrived on time, hair still damp from a shower, moving with the loose, easy gait of someone who had gotten a full night's sleep, which the schedule said should not have been possible given how many additional hours she had logged. You've been running unauthorized sessions, I said. I filed for them. She sat down without being asked, comfortable in a way that made the small office feel like it belonged to her instead of me. Through the terminal. Is that a problem? Nobody told me there was a limit on requesting extra time. The limit is common sense. Your body needs recovery time between exposures. That's not a rule someone forgot to write down. It's a basic biological requirement. Something crossed her face. Not defensiveness. Something closer to genuine confusion. Like I had told her water was wet, and she wanted to know why I felt the need to mention it. I mean, yeah, obviously, she said. I'm not skipping recovery. I sleep like 8 hours a night. I eat the calories they tell me to eat. I'm not being reckless about it. You've tripled your daily exposure. The exposure isn't that bad though. She said this the way someone describes a workout that left them pleasantly sore, rather than a physiological event that had, according to every model I owned, no business being survivable at the pace she was attempting it. Like, it's hard. I'm not saying it's not hard, but it's not, it's not actually bad. I asked her what bad would look like to her, because at that point, I genuinely wanted to know, and the answer she gave me sat in my chest for a long time afterward, unresolved, the way certain sentences do. Bad is when you can't tell if the thing hunting you knows you're already hurt, she said. This is just gravity. She said it the way someone mentions the weather. No weight behind it. No performance for my benefit. It was simply, to her, an accurate description of two different categories of experience, and she had sorted this training program firmly into the lesser one. I did not have a follow-up question ready. I have thought of several since, lying awake at odd hours, running the conversation back the way you run your tongue over a chipped tooth, checking if it still feels the way you remember. At the time, all I managed to say was that I would need to review whether her unauthorized sessions could continue, and she nodded, entirely unbothered, and asked if that meant she should stop doing them starting today, or if she had time to finish out the week. I told her to stop immediately. She did stop, for exactly 4 days, and I remember feeling a small, foolish satisfaction at having reasserted some kind of order over a situation that had started to feel like it was sliding out from under me. On the 5th day, the equipment logs showed a new pattern. She had stopped filing for extra sessions through the terminal. She had started doing them in the gym instead, using free weights and a resistance harness meant for general conditioning, manually approximating the training protocol with equipment that was never designed for it, timing herself against a wall clock because she did not have access to the calibrated instruments in the training chamber. Nobody had told her to stop doing that. Nobody had thought to. I sat in my office that evening with her adjusted numbers in front of me and understood, for the first time with real clarity, that I was not dealing with a cadet who needed to be protected from an aggressive training program. I was dealing with a cadet the training program needed to be protected from. I pulled her childhood records that night. I told myself it was routine due diligence, the kind of background review any careful biologist runs when a subject's baseline behavior stops matching the model. That was not entirely true. Some part of me needed to know, the way you need to press on a bruise just to confirm it still hurts. Human record-keeping on Category 9 worlds is inconsistent by nature, given how much of the population spends its early years simply trying to remain alive rather than filing paperwork about it. But Grace's region kept unusually thorough civil registries. I found her birth record, her school enrollment, a gap of 4 months at age 6 with no entries at all, followed by a medical intake form logged at a regional clinic. I opened the medical form expecting a childhood illness, fevers, broken bones, the ordinary catalog of a hard childhood on a hard world. Predator encounter, the form read. Survived. Nothing else. No elaboration. No follow-up notes about counseling or long-term care. The kind of documentation I would expect to find trailing behind any child who had lived through something serious enough to require the words survived written on an official form. I searched for a corresponding note in her school file, expecting an extended absence, a transfer to another facility, some visible fracture in the record where a normal life should have paused to absorb a catastrophic event. She was back in class 11 days later. I sat with that number for a long time. 11 days. I have colleagues from soft worlds who take longer than that to recover from a minor surgical procedure. I found myself doing the thing I do when a dataset refuses to make sense, which is checking it against itself for errors, assuming the mistake belongs to the record rather than the reality it describes. The record was not wrong. I kept reading. There were more entries like it, scattered through her file with the same clipped, procedural language, the same absence of elaboration. Age 9, a storm displacement, the phrase used to describe an event where the local magnetic field failure exposed her settlement to several hours of unshielded radiation, and the entire population had to shelter in reinforced structures built specifically for that purpose, structures that existed on her homeworld, the way storm shelters exist on worlds with tornadoes, except the storms in question could strip skin from bone if you were caught outside them. Age 13, listed only as territorial incident, no further detail, filed alongside a note that she had missed 4 days of school, and then returned. By the time I reached her 16th year, I had stopped being surprised by the entries, and started being surprised by something else entirely. The absence of anything resembling trauma response in her adult psychological evaluations. Every intake screening a cadet undergoes before joining the training program includes a standard battery of assessments designed to catch exactly the kind of damage her childhood record suggested she should be carrying: hypervigilance, sleep disturbance. The particular flinch response that develops in any creature that has learned the world is not safe. Her scores came back within normal range on every measure, not suppressed, not masked, as far as our detection methods could tell, and our methods are good, calibrated across hundreds of species specifically to catch masking. Simply, genuinely, unremarkably normal. I remember sitting back in my chair and saying something out loud to the empty office, a habit I have when a problem gets large enough that silence stops being useful. What I said was, "This isn't resilience. This is a different baseline entirely." I did not sleep well that night. When I did sleep, I dreamed about storm shelters, though I have never seen one, and I woke up with the specific unease of having borrowed someone else's memory without permission. The containment breach happened on hour 340, during a scheduled stress test that had nothing to do with gravity at all. Every Deathworld cadet undergoes environmental stress testing alongside the physical conditioning program, a series of controlled encounters with simulated threats, meant to establish baseline reaction times and decision-making under pressure. The simulations use holographic projection paired with limited physical props, nothing capable of causing real harm, designed to trigger a genuine startle response without genuine danger. Grace's session that day involved a simulated predator encounter, drawn from a generic threat template our system uses for cadets without species-specific data available. A four-legged shape, roughly the size of a large dog, moving with the erratic quickness that reads as dangerous to most humanoid nervous systems, regardless of species origin. I was watching from the observation booth, alongside Ensign Daniel Cole, a junior officer assigned to log reaction metrics. The simulation began. The projected shape burst from behind a barrier at the far end of the test room, closing distance at a speed calibrated to be difficult, but survivable for an alert human cadet. Grace's whole body changed before I finished processing that the simulation had even started. Not startled, not frightened, not in any way I recognized as fear. Her posture dropped low, her weight shifting into a stance I would later learn was called a ground stance, the kind of positioning taught to children on her homeworld before they are taught to read. Her breathing did not spike. If anything, it slowed, the way a held breath slows before a decision. She did not run. The simulated predator closed the final distance, and Grace moved sideways instead of back, redirecting rather than retreating, one hand snapping out to intercept the projection's leading edge, in a grab that would have connected with real muscle and bone, if the threat had been real at all. The simulation registered the contact and terminated, the projected shape dissolving into scattered light, the way it was designed to when a cadet successfully neutralized the encounter. Daniel let out a breath beside me. That's not in the training manual. No, I agreed. It isn't. I pulled the recording afterward and reviewed it frame by frame, the way I do with any anomalous result, looking for the moment where instinct should have shown a crack, a hesitation, some small proof that what I had watched was a trained response, layered thin over an ordinary human fear reaction. There was no crack. Her heart rate data, pulled from the biometric monitor she wore during every session, showed an increase of only 11 beats per minute during the entire encounter. 11. I have seen cadets from peaceful colony worlds register spikes of 80 or more during a simulation, a fraction as aggressive as the one Grace had just walked through, without apparent effort. I found her afterward in the corridor outside the test room, toweling sweat from the back of her neck, and asked her, as neutrally as I could manage, what had gone through her mind during the encounter. She thought about it for a moment, genuinely trying to answer honestly, rather than performing an answer for me. Honestly? I was thinking it was slower than the ones back home, she said. Like, noticeably slower. I almost didn't grab it in time because I kept waiting for it to speed up. It didn't speed up because it isn't real. Right. Yeah. I figured that out about half a second in. But muscle memory doesn't really care what's real, you know? Your hands just do the thing. She shrugged, folding the towel over one shoulder. Is that bad? Did I mess up the test? I told her she had not messed up the test. I did not tell her that the test had, in a sense, failed to test anything at all, because it had been built around an assumption of fear that her body had simply declined to participate in. That night I filed an incident report, not because anything dangerous had occurred, but because I did not know what else to do with the growing certainty that our entire assessment framework had been built for a species that did not, technically, include the one currently walking through it. The real containment breach came 9 days later, and it had nothing to do with Grace at all, which is precisely why it ended up teaching me more about her than any scheduled test could have. A maintenance failure in the lower deck's biological testing wing released a contained specimen population into the ventilation system, an event that should never happen, and that our safety protocols are specifically designed to prevent, through 3 separate redundant systems, all 3 of which failed within the same 11-minute window, due to a fault in the shared power relay nobody had thought to isolate. The specimens in question were a breeding population of Koresh striders, an aggressive arboreal species native to a mid-hostility world 2 systems over, kept on station for ongoing research into rapid neurological adaptation. Individually, a Koresh strider poses limited danger to an adult humanoid. In a swarm, moving through enclosed corridors with limited visibility, their coordinated hunting behavior becomes considerably more serious, and station protocol treats any swarm release as a level 3 emergency requiring full corridor lockdown. The alarm went up while I was 2 decks above the breach, in a meeting with Commander Blake reviewing quarterly cadet performance. We heard the klaxon before either of us finished our sentence. Lower deck, Owen said, already moving. Testing wing. I followed him toward the nearest emergency terminal, my mind running through the list of who had scheduled sessions in that section of the station that morning, and my stomach dropped through several decks of the ship before my conscious thoughts caught up to why. Grace had a training block scheduled in the auxiliary gravity chamber, adjacent to the testing wing, starting 11 minutes before the alarm. The terminal showed the corridor cameras cutting in and out as the swarm interfered with the sensor network, striders moving fast and low along the walls in the particular scattering pattern that makes them so difficult to track visually, even under good conditions. I counted perhaps a dozen shapes across 3 different camera feeds before the picture dissolved into static. "Get me eyes on the auxiliary chamber," Owen said into his comm, voice flat in the specific way people go flat when they are actively refusing to let themselves panic. The feed cut back in 7 seconds later, 7 seconds that felt considerably longer, and showed the corridor outside the auxiliary chamber, striders moving through it in a loose hunting formation, and Grace standing in the chamber doorway with a fire extinguisher held in both hands like a weapon, positioned between the swarm and 2 engineers crouched behind her. I recognized both engineers from the maintenance roster, Peter Wren and a technician named Nora Finch, neither of them combat trained, both of them caught in the corridor when the lockdown protocols failed to seal in time. Grace was not retreating into the chamber with them. She was standing in the open doorway, holding the position, watching the swarm the way you watch weather rolling in, calculating rather than fearing. "She needs to get behind the door," I said, hearing my own voice come out thinner than I intended. "The door won't seal with her standing in it," Owen said. "She knows that. That's why she's not moving." One strider broke from the loose formation and lunged, and Grace's extinguisher came down in a short, controlled arc, catching the creature across its foreleg joint hard enough to send it skidding back into the pack, not injured badly, but startled enough that the whole formation hesitated, recalculating. She used that hesitation, stepped back exactly 1 pace, enough to let the door begin its seal cycle without abandoning the doorway entirely, angling her body so the closing door would protect her flank, while keeping the extinguisher between herself and the corridor for as long as the gap allowed. The door sealed with 3 centimeters to spare between its edge and her shoulder. I found out later, from the maintenance log, that the entire encounter had lasted 40 seconds. It felt considerably longer watching it, and I suspect it will continue to feel considerably longer every time I remember it for the rest of my life. Owen and I reached the auxiliary chamber 6 minutes after full lockdown cleared, once station security had contained the swarm using proper equipment. Peter Wren was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, the specific pale color of someone whose adrenaline has just finished its work and left exhaustion in its place. Nora Finch was standing near him, arms wrapped around herself, watching Grace with an expression I did not have a name for yet. Grace herself was crouched near the sealed door, extinguisher set down beside her, checking a shallow scratch along her forearm, where one of the striders had connected despite her guard. "You're bleeding," I said, because it was the only sentence that arrived first. "It's fine, it's shallow." She examined it with the mild curiosity of someone checking a paper cut. "Are Peter and Nora okay? They got caught out here when the door didn't seal in time." I looked past her at the 2 engineers, both of them very clearly not okay in the way people are not okay after nearly dying, both of them staring at Grace with the specific mixture of gratitude and something close to disbelief that I would come to recognize, over the following weeks, as the standard reaction of anyone who watched her work for the first time. "They're fine," Peter managed, from the floor. "Because of you. You didn't have to do that. You could have gone into the chamber and sealed the door and left us out there." Grace looked at him like he had suggested something faintly absurd. Why would I do that? Nobody had an answer for her, because the question, from where she was standing, did not require one. It was simply, to her, the obvious response to 2 unarmed people caught outside a ceiling door during a swarm breach. Not heroism, not a choice weighed and made. A reflex, the same category of action as catching a falling object before it hits the ground, except the falling object in this case had been 2 human lives. I sat with Grace afterward while station medical cleaned and closed the scratch on her arm, and I asked her, carefully, whether the encounter had frightened her. She considered the question with real effort, the way you consider a question in a language you speak fluently, but rarely have to translate into words. "Not really," she said eventually. "I mean, I was paying attention. You have to pay attention or you get hurt. But scared, like, panicking, no, it wasn't that kind of thing. She glanced at the closed door, at the corridor beyond it where the swarm had been contained and removed. Back home, this would have been, like, a Tuesday. A bad Tuesday, but a Tuesday. I wrote that phrase down in my notes that night, word for word, because I did not trust myself to remember it accurately otherwise, and because some instinct told me I would need it later, when I was trying to explain to someone else, or possibly to myself, exactly when I stopped understanding what I was looking at. Owen filed a commendation for her that week. I filed something else, a quiet, private note in my own research log, the first entry in what would become a much longer document, one that eventually left the training program entirely and became something closer to a confession. The note read, "Our models are not wrong about danger, they are wrong about her." I did not yet know how wrong, or how much further that wrongness would stretch before the program reached its final hour. Captain Henry Voss called me to his office on hour 408, and I knew before I sat down that the meeting had nothing to do with routine oversight, because Captain Voss did not summon staff biologists for routine anything. He had my incident reports open on his desk display when I walked in. All of them. The unauthorized session logs, the simulated predator encounter, the containment breach report, arranged in a neat column like evidence at a hearing. "Walk me through this," he said, without preamble, gesturing at the display. "In plain terms, what am I looking at?" I had rehearsed an answer to this question in the privacy of my own head for weeks, turning different versions of it over, discarding the ones that sounded too much like panic and the ones that sounded too much like dismissal. What I settled on, standing in his office with the weight of his attention on me, was the plainest version I had. "I think our gravity program was built to test a limit that doesn't apply to this cadet," I said, "and I think every other part of our assessment framework has the same problem, and I don't know how far it extends." Voss leaned back in his chair. He is not a man given to visible reaction, a trait that has served him well across 3 decades of fleet command. But something in his jaw shifted, the smallest possible tell. "Explain the doesn't apply part." I explained it the way I understood it at that point, which was still incomplete, still forming, but coherent enough to lay out. I told him about the gravity numbers exceeding every historical benchmark without corresponding physiological collapse. I told him about the childhood medical records, the 11-day recovery window after an event our own records classified as severe, the storm displacements treated with the same procedural shrug as a scraped knee. I told him about the simulated predator test, the 11-beat heart rate spike where our models predicted 80 or more. I told him about the swarm breach, about Grace holding a doorway against a dozen striders with a fire extinguisher, because retreating without the 2 engineers behind her had apparently not registered, in her calculation, as an option worth considering. She wasn't being brave, I said, and this was the part I had struggled hardest to phrase correctly, because I did not want it heard as praise, and I did not want it heard as alarm, and it was, somehow, both of those things and neither of them at once. Bravery implies overcoming fear. I don't think she experienced enough fear in that moment to overcome. I think what we're calling courage in her file is just her species' ordinary operating baseline, and we've been grading her against a curve built for people who don't share it. Voss was quiet for a long moment, turning a stylus over in his fingers, a habit I had seen him fall into during difficult decisions. "You're telling me our entire Deathworld classification system might be miscalibrated for this species?" "I'm telling you I think it's miscalibrated for this specific example of the species, at minimum. Whether that generalizes, I don't know yet. I'd need a larger sample to be certain. But if even a meaningful fraction of humans from her homeworld share this baseline, then every threat assessment we've run on their planet, every hostility rating, every recommendation about what kind of postings they're suited for, all of it was built using the wrong ruler." "Give me a number," Voss said. "If you had to guess, how much of our current framework survives contact with this data?" I did not want to answer that question, because I did not like the honest answer, and I liked even less what the honest answer implied about how many other assumptions across the fleet's dealings with humanity might be built on the same faulty ruler. "Less than half," I said, "possibly considerably less." Voss set the stylus down. "Keep observing her. Full access. Whatever equipment you need. I want a complete profile before the program reaches its final testing phase, and I want it substantiated well enough that nobody above my rank can wave it away as anecdote." I told him I would need broader authorization to pull comparative data from other Deathworld classified human cadets across the fleet's other training stations, to establish whether what I was seeing in Grace was individual or systemic. He granted it before I finished the sentence. The comparative data took 11 days to compile, and every day added weight to a conclusion I had already, privately, stopped doubting. There were 4 other human cadets from Category 9 classified regions, currently active in fleet training programs across 3 different stations. I requested their full physiological and psychological records, cross-referenced against the same benchmarks I had used for Grace. None of them matched her gravity tolerance exactly. That detail mattered to me, because it meant what I was looking at was not a species-wide anomaly so uniform it bordered on implausible, which would have made me suspicious of my own methodology. It was something narrower and, in its own way, more unsettling. All 4 of the other cadets showed the same pattern of exceeding predicted physiological limits by a wide margin, without the corresponding psychological damage our models expected to find sitting underneath that resilience. All 4 had childhood medical records containing the same clipped, procedural entries describing events that should have required years of recovery, followed by return to normal life timelines measured in days. One of the cadets, stationed at a training facility 3 systems over, had a service record that included a written commendation from her commanding officer for what the report described as calm, decisive leadership during a hull breach event that had killed 2 crew members and left 11 injured. I read the full incident report attached to that commendation and found, buried in a supplementary note near the bottom, a detail that made me set my tablet down and sit very still for several minutes before I could continue. The cadet in question had, after the breach was sealed and the immediate crisis resolved, spent the following 40 minutes personally administering field triage to injured crew members before allowing anyone to treat the burns on her own hands, which she had sustained pulling a jammed emergency hatch open with her bare fingers. The note did not describe this as extraordinary. It was filed, procedurally, as a standard element of the incident timeline, the same tone used to describe the malfunction that caused the breach in the first place. Nobody involved in writing that report seemed to consider the cadet's behavior remarkable enough to warrant separate commentary. I began to understand, reading that file, that this was not a story about one exceptional individual. It was a story about an entire species whose baseline had been shaped by a world with no patience for weakness, a world that had, generation after generation, quietly selected for exactly the traits our training programs were designed to test the outer limits of, and had been doing so for long enough that those traits had stopped registering, among humans themselves, as anything worth commenting on. I thought about the phrase Grace had used, sitting in the medical bay with a scratch closing on her forearm. Back home, this would have been a Tuesday. I had written it down at the time because it unsettled me. I understood now, reading through 5 different cadet files that told some version of the same story, that it had not been an exaggeration or a performance of toughness for my benefit. It had been, as far as I could determine, a literal and unremarkable statement of fact. The second major incident happened on hour 612, during a joint exercise that combined gravity conditioning with a live fire evasion drill, a scenario meant to test whether cadets could maintain tactical judgment under simultaneous physical and cognitive load. I was not supposed to be observing that exercise directly. My clearance covered biological monitoring, not tactical evaluation, but Captain Voss had authorized my presence given the ongoing review, and I sat in the secondary observation gallery beside Ensign Cole and a tactical instructor named Officer Nora Finch, the same technician Grace had shielded during the swarm breach, reassigned since then to instructional duties after what the personnel file described, with considerable understatement, as a re-evaluation of her comfort working in exposed field conditions. The exercise ran 3 cadets through a simulated evacuation scenario at elevated gravity, requiring them to move an injured mannequin representing a wounded crew member through a debris field, while automated defense turrets fired non-lethal deterrent rounds calibrated to simulate hostile fire. The exercise was going according to design for the first 6 minutes. Then a genuine equipment fault caused one of the deterrent turrets to misfire, discharging a live calibration round instead of the intended non-lethal payload, a mistake in the maintenance schedule that would later cost someone their post but which, in that moment, meant a projectile with real stopping force was suddenly loose, in a training space, with 3 cadets in it. The round struck a support strut above the debris field, and the strut, already stressed by the elevated gravity setting, began to fail. I watched the readout spike on Owen's monitor a full second before the visual confirmation came through. A structural collapse warning flashing red across a section of ceiling directly above where 2 cadets were crouched behind cover. I do not have a clean memory of the next several seconds. I have the recording, which I have watched more times than I am willing to admit, and what the recording shows is this. Grace was the 3rd cadet, positioned furthest from the collapsing strut, close to 15 meters away, in the middle of hauling the mannequin toward the extraction point when the ceiling gave way. She dropped the mannequin. For half a second, watching the recording for the first time, I felt something cold settle in my chest, an old instinct from the girl I had read about in the incident reports, an instinct that told me this was the moment, finally, where self-preservation would win out over whatever strange calculus governed her decisions. She was not running from the collapse. She was running toward the 2 cadets underneath it, closing 15 meters of debris field, at a speed the sensor logs would later measure as faster than any recorded human sprint on file, at elevated gravity, across unstable ground. She reached the 2 cadets 3 seconds before the strut finished its fall. What she did in those 3 seconds, according to the recording, was position herself directly beneath the failing section, plant her feet against the debris-strewn floor, and get both arms up to intercept the falling mass, not stopping it entirely. Nothing could have stopped it entirely, but redirecting enough of its trajectory that it came down at an angle, sliding past the 2 cadets instead of directly onto them, at the cost of the falling structure catching her across the shoulder and driving her down hard against the floor. The alarm that followed was not the drill's alarm. It was real, station-wide, the kind that clears every corridor and locks down every door, because the system had correctly registered actual structural failure and actual casualties, requiring actual emergency response. I do not remember standing up from my chair in the observation gallery. I remember being in the corridor, moving faster than I have moved in years. Owen, somewhere ahead of me, shouting into his comm for a medical team, and I remember reaching the debris field and seeing Grace pinned partially beneath the collapsed section, one arm free, using it to keep pressure against a gash along her ribs, while she called out, voice strained but entirely coherent, asking whether the 2 cadets she had reached were clear. They were clear, bruised, one with a fractured wrist from the fall, but clear, both of them alive because a woman from a Category 9 world had done the arithmetic on 15 meters and a falling ceiling and decided, apparently without any visible internal debate, that the correct answer was to run toward it. Medical extracted her 40 minutes later, once the debris had been stabilized enough to move safely. I stayed with her the entire time, holding a compress against the gash along her ribs because it gave my hands something necessary to do, and somewhere in those 40 minutes, she looked up at me with the particular half-focused expression of someone managing genuine physical pain, without letting it take the wheel entirely, and she said something I have not been able to stop turning over since. "Are the readings still going to count?" she asked. "Or does this mess up my hours?" I told her the readings would count. I did not tell her that I had, somewhere in those 40 minutes, stopped thinking about her as a subject in a study, and started thinking about her as something else entirely, something my professional training had no established category for. She was moved to medical for observation. Her injuries, once fully assessed, amounted to 2 cracked ribs, a deep laceration requiring sealant, and significant bruising across her right shoulder, where the falling structure had caught her. She was requesting to resume training within 36 hours. Medical denied the request on the grounds of standard recovery protocol. Grace filed a formal appeal, citing her own assessment of her functional capacity, supported by a physical demonstration she performed for the attending physician that involved lifting a fully loaded equipment case with the arm attached to her uninjured shoulder, while explaining, in careful, patient detail, exactly which of her movements were and were not compromised by the injury. The appeal was denied a second time. She accepted the second denial with visible reluctance but did not push further, which I noted at the time as one of the only moments across the entire program where she deferred to a limit that was not, strictly, biological. I sat with her chart that night for a long time after everyone else had gone. 2 cracked ribs, a species that treats structural collapse the way most species treat a bad storm. A cadet asking whether her injury would cost her training hours, instead of asking whether she was going to be all right. I began drafting the document that would eventually become my resignation that same evening, though I did not recognize it as that yet. At the time, I only knew that I needed to write down, in language precise enough to survive scrutiny, the exact shape of what I had learned, because I suspected that once the program reached its final phase, nobody would believe me unless I had already put it plainly on record. I titled the document, simply, "What We Have Been Measuring Wrong." I would not finish it until after hour 900. Hour 870 arrived on a station standard morning that looked, on the surface, like every other morning of the program. I had stopped sleeping well weeks earlier, a fact I mention not for sympathy, but because it matters to what happened next, because a tired mind notices things a rested one might have explained away. The final phase of the 900-hour program is called, in the training manual, Sustained Integration Testing. In practice, it is the phase specifically designed to break cadets who have made it this far, without breaking. Every prior phase increases one variable at a time, gravity alone, or threat exposure alone, or sleep restriction alone, giving the body a single problem to solve. The final 30 hours combine all of it at once, gravity cycling unpredictably between baseline and the cadet's personal ceiling, threat simulations layered without warning, minimal rest between blocks, all of it stacked to simulate the worst realistic day a fleet officer might ever face, compressed and repeated until something gives. In 11 years, something had always given. That was, in a sense, the entire design philosophy of the phase. It existed to locate the floor beneath a cadet's resilience, so command would know, before deployment, exactly where that floor sat. I watched Grace enter the final testing chamber at 0600, and for the first time in the program, I saw something in her posture that looked, almost, like tension, not fear. Something closer to anticipation, the specific coiled readiness of someone who has been waiting a long time for a real test, and has started to worry the wait itself might be the only real challenge involved. The first 6 hours went as the manual predicted for a strong cadet. Gravity cycled between baseline and 4 times standard in unpredictable intervals, forcing her body to constantly readjust, rather than settle into any stable rhythm, and layered across that cycling were threat simulations, some real in the sense of physical obstacles, some purely sensory, designed to fracture concentration through sound and light disruption, timed to catch her at her most physically taxed moments. Grace moved through all of it with the same unhurried competence I had come to expect, and somewhere around hour 4 of the block I noticed Owen, beside me in the observation booth, exhale slowly through his nose, the particular sound of a man recalibrating his expectations in real time. Hour 12 is when the equipment failed, and this time it was not sabotage or maintenance oversight. It was, simply, the chamber's gravity generator reaching the outer edge of its design tolerance and beginning to fail in the worst possible way, cycling not on schedule but at random, spiking without warning to levels the system had never been engineered to sustain for more than a few seconds at a time. The first uncontrolled spike hit 7 times standard gravity and lasted 4 seconds before the system corrected itself. The second, 11 minutes later, hit 7.8 and lasted 6. I was already on comms to engineering by the third spike, watching numbers climb on a system that had stopped behaving like a controlled variable and started behaving like a genuine hazard, and I remember the specific fear that settled into my chest during those minutes, a fear that had nothing to do with what Grace's body could or could not withstand, and everything to do with the fact that our equipment was now the danger, not the test it was supposed to be running. "Get her out," I said, and I meant it as an order, even though giving orders was not, technically, within my authority. Owen was already moving toward the emergency release, hand hovering over the control that would flood the chamber with a rescue team and terminate the exercise regardless of protocol, when the fourth spike hit. 8.6 times standard gravity, the highest number that chamber's instruments had ever recorded, on any cadet, for any reason. Grace went down. Not gracefully, not the controlled drop of someone managing a difficult adjustment. She went down hard, the way a structure goes down when a support has genuinely failed, and for 3 full seconds, the longest 3 seconds of my professional life, she did not move at all. I do not remember Owen's hand finishing its motion toward the release, I remember the chamber doors already opening, the medical team already moving, and I remember running in behind them, without any clear memory of deciding to run, my body simply arriving at the decision faster than my thoughts could organize around it. Grace was breathing when I reached her. That was the first thing I confirmed, kneeling beside her on a floor still humming faintly with residual gravitational strain as the system finished its emergency shutdown cycle. Breathing, eyes open, focused, tracking the medical team's movements around her with the alert, assessing look of someone gathering information, rather than someone in shock. "I'm okay," she said, before anyone had asked. "Give me a second. I just need a second." The medical lead, a brisk, no-nonsense officer whose name I did not learn until much later, was already running a scanner over her, calling out vitals to the rest of the team in the clipped shorthand of someone who has done this exact job during exactly this kind of emergency more times than she would like to count. Heart rate elevated but stable, no cardiac irregularity, pupils responsive. She paused, checking the scanner again, and something in her expression shifted, confusion layered under the professional calm. No skeletal fracture, no internal bleeding indicators. "I want to run a second pass, because these numbers don't match an 8.6 impact." They did not match, because Grace's body had, once again, simply declined to sustain the damage the equipment's own history said it should have. She sat up, 11 minutes later, against the medical team's initial recommendation, insisting with quiet, immovable persistence, until they relented and allowed it under close supervision. I sat beside her on the chamber floor while the engineering team worked to diagnose the failed generator, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything at all. Then Grace did something I had not seen her do, across 870 hours of observation. She started to cry. I want to describe this carefully, because it would be easy, telling it badly, to make it sound like the collapse everyone had been quietly expecting since the beginning of the program, the moment where the Deathworld Cadet finally broke the way every prior cadet had broken. That is not what I watched. I need to be precise about the difference, because the difference is the entire point. She was not shaking. Her breathing did not spiral into the ragged, uneven rhythm of panic. Her hands, resting loose in her lap, were steady. What moved was something quieter, something happening entirely behind her eyes, tears sliding down in a slow, continuous line, while the rest of her remained composed, almost eerily so, like grief that had arrived without permission and found the rest of the body unwilling to make room for it. "I'm sorry," she said and laughed, a small, confused sound with no real humor behind it. "I don't know why I'm doing this. I'm fine. Nothing's actually wrong." I did not say anything. I had learned across the preceding months that the most useful thing I could offer her in a moment like this was silence with attention behind it, rather than a question that would send her scrambling to perform composure for my benefit. She wiped at her face with the back of one hand, visibly frustrated with her own reaction, the frustration of someone whose body has started doing something her mind has not authorized. "It's just," she stopped, started again. "This whole program, this whole 900 hours, nobody's actually tried to kill me. Like, actually. The equipment glitched. Sure, that was scary, but nobody was hunting me. Nothing was trying to figure out if I was hurt enough to catch. I've just been, I don't know, training, sleeping 8 hours, eating regular meals, having actual days where the worst thing that happens is gravity being annoying." She looked at her hands like she was trying to find the right words written somewhere across her palms. "I think that's the first time that's ever happened to me. Not since I was little. Maybe not ever." I felt something crack open in my own chest, listening to that sentence, a feeling I did not have adequate professional vocabulary for, and still, honestly, do not. "You're saying this program has been restful," I said, carefully, because I needed to hear the shape of the idea out loud to believe I had understood it correctly. "I know that sounds insane." She laughed again, wetter this time, and did not try to stop the tears anymore, letting them run while she talked, which struck me as its own kind of courage, though not the kind our training manuals had ever thought to measure. "You built this thing to break people. I get that. I read the program history before I signed up, and I kept waiting for it to actually get to me, and instead I just kept thinking, this is nice. This is genuinely, actually nice. I get to sleep in the same bed every night. Nobody's rationing the food. Nobody's timing the radiation storms wrong and catching half the settlement out in the open. I just have to lift things and get pushed around by gravity, and then it's over, and I get to eat dinner and go to sleep and do it again tomorrow. She pressed the heel of her hand against one eye, breathing out slowly, steadying herself through an act of will I could see her performing in real time. I didn't know I was tired, she said, quieter now, mostly to herself. I didn't know until there wasn't anything left to be scared of, and it turned out there was all this other stuff underneath, just waiting. I did not try to name the feeling for her. I did not tell her the word grief, or relief, or the several other clinical terms my training offered as options, because I understood, sitting there on that floor beside her, that naming it correctly was not actually my job in that moment, and that anything I said risked closing a door she had only just found the courage to open. What I did instead was stay. I sat with her for the better part of an hour, on a floor still faintly warm from a gravity generator that had nearly killed her and somehow had not, while she cried the particular, undramatic tears of someone finally safe enough to notice how tired she actually was. And I understood, more clearly than I had understood anything else across the entire 900 hours, that I had spent months measuring the wrong thing entirely. I had been trying to find her breaking point. She did not have a breaking point built out of gravity, or threat, or physical strain. She had a breaking point built out of stillness, out of safety, out of the unfamiliar experience of a world that was not actively, constantly trying to end her. And our training program, designed across 11 years to be the cruelest experience command could construct, had accidentally become the gentlest thing that had ever happened to her. The final 30 hours of the program resumed the following day, once engineering had repaired the failed generator and medical had cleared Grace for continued participation. A clearance she fought for with the same quiet, immovable persistence she had used to get out of bed rest 24 hours after cracking 2 ribs. She completed the remaining hours without further incident, moving through the last stretch of sustained integration testing with a kind of settled calm that had not been present at the start of the block, as though whatever had cracked open in her during those minutes on the chamber floor had, rather than weakening her, cleared something out of the way. I watched the final countdown from the observation booth, standing beside Owen, both of us silent, watching the timer on the main display tick down through the last minutes of hour 900. At 0, the chamber's gravity settled back to standard, and Grace stood in the center of the room, breathing normally, undamaged in any way our instruments could detect, having just completed the single most demanding training block our fleet's records had ever documented for any cadet of any species. She looked up at the observation window, found me through the glass, and did something that broke something loose in my chest all over again. She smiled, small, tired, entirely genuine. Then she asked, through the comm, whether there was any food left in the mess hall, because she was, apparently, starving. I laughed, and the sound surprised me, because I had not expected to have any laughter left in me after everything the past 900 hours had taken out of my understanding of the universe. There was food left. There was, as it turned out, a great deal still left to understand. I had a document still sitting unfinished on my terminal, titled, What We Have Been Measuring Wrong, and I knew, watching Grace walk out of that chamber under her own power, unbroken in every sense our program had been built to test, that I would need to finish writing it soon, because I no longer believed I could, in good conscience, continue running a program built on assumptions I now understood to be fundamentally incomplete. I did not know yet exactly what finishing that document would cost me. I would find out within the week. Grace graduated the program 4 days later, in a ceremony so routine it barely registered as an event, a handful of officers standing in a briefing room, while Captain Voss read her completion certification into the record and shook her hand. There was no fanfare. Fleet does not celebrate cadets for completing a mandatory program the way it celebrates them for extraordinary individual acts. And by the letter of the regulations, Grace had simply done what was required of her. Nothing more. I stood at the back of that room and thought about 8.6 times standard gravity, about a fire extinguisher held against a swarm, about 15 meters closed at a dead sprint beneath a collapsing ceiling, about tears that had nothing to do with pain, and I understood that the room's quiet, procedural indifference to what I had watched her survive was, itself, a kind of evidence. Nobody in that room had the framework to recognize what they were looking at. I had spent 900 hours building that framework, piece by piece, and I still was not certain I had built it correctly. I finished the document that night. What we have been measuring wrong ran to 41 pages by the time I stopped writing, longer than any report I had filed in 19 years of service, dense with cited incidents, comparative data pulled from 5 cadets across 3 stations, physiological benchmarks laid alongside outcomes that consistently, uniformly refused to match them. The conclusion, when I finally wrote it, took me the better part of an hour to phrase correctly, because I wanted it stated plainly enough that nobody could later claim to have misunderstood me. Our entire framework for classifying threat, resilience, and hostility, I wrote, was built around the assumption that difficulty is an absolute measurement, a fixed quantity that means the same thing to every species regardless of origin. This assumption is false. Difficulty is relative to what a species was shaped by. A test we designed to be the cruelest experience in a cadet's career can, for a cadet raised on a world hostile enough, function instead as the safest and most restful experience of their life. We are not measuring resilience. We are measuring the gap between a species' baseline and our own, and for humans originating from Category 9 environments, that gap is wide enough to invalidate nearly every comparative model we currently use. I attached my recommendation for a full framework review across the fleet's Deathworld classification system, effective immediately, pending independent verification of my findings. Then I wrote my resignation. I submitted both documents to Captain Voss the following morning, together, in the same message, because I wanted him to read the reasoning and the consequence of that reasoning in the same sitting, rather than let him separate one from the other. He called me into his office within the hour. "You understand what you're asking me to do," he said, once I had taken the seat across from him. He did not sound angry. He sounded, if anything, tired, in the specific way command tires people. The exhaustion of holding responsibility for outcomes you cannot fully control. 41 pages, telling me our threat classification system has been built on false assumptions for as long as anyone alive can remember, and underneath it, your resignation. "I understand exactly what I'm asking," I said. "I can't keep running an oversight program that measures the wrong thing. Every day I continue in this role, I'm signing off on assessments I no longer believe in. That's not something I can do in good conscience, regardless of how the review committee eventually rules on the report. You could stay and fight for the framework change from inside the position. That carries more weight than a resignation letter." "It might," I admitted, "but I've spent 900 hours watching a system fail to see what was directly in front of it, and I don't trust myself to keep operating inside that system without eventually adjusting my own perception to match its blind spots instead of correcting them. I'd rather leave loudly than stay quietly." Voss was silent for a long moment, turning that same stylus over in his fingers, and when he finally spoke, his voice had shifted into something quieter, less official. "For what it's worth," he said, "I don't think you're wrong. About any of it. I watched the same recordings you did." He set the stylus down. "I'll route the framework review through command channels myself. It'll move faster with my name attached than a departing biologist's, whether that's a fair reflection of how these things should work or not." I thanked him, and meant it, and understood that this was likely the last conversation I would ever have with a man who had, across the length of the program, taken my findings seriously, when he could easily have dismissed them as an overreaction. He accepted my resignation, effective in 2 weeks, standard notice period, enough time to complete a full handoff of my records to whoever took the position after me. I spent most of those 2 weeks writing documentation, transferring case files, answering questions from a nervous junior biologist named Lucy Bennett, who had been assigned to take over cadet oversight, and who kept asking me, with increasing disbelief, whether the numbers in Grace's file were genuinely accurate or the result of some equipment calibration error nobody had caught. I told her, every time, that the numbers were accurate. I told her to expect more numbers like them, from other cadets, on other stations, once people started actually looking. I found Grace on my second-to-last day, in the station's observation deck, looking out at the slow drift of stars through the reinforced viewport, off-duty, dressed down, no longer the cadet I had watched climb through 900 hours of engineered hardship, but something closer to a person simply existing in a quiet moment, which was, I realized, still a novelty for her, still something she had to consciously let herself do, rather than something that came naturally. "Heard you're leaving," she said, without turning around, before I had said anything at all. News travels fast on a station this size. Small station, big rumor mill. She glanced back at me, something careful in her expression, an emotion I could not immediately place. "Is it because of me? The program, I mean. What happened?" I considered lying, softening it, the way I might have done 19 years earlier, before this particular assignment had worn most of the instinct for professional distance out of me. "Yes," I said instead. "In large part, yes. Not because anything went wrong with you. Because everything I understood about how to measure a person like you turned out to be built on the wrong foundation, and I don't think I can keep doing this job, honestly, while standing on it." She turned fully to face me, arms loosely crossed, considering that answer with the same careful attention she gave every problem worth solving. "For what it's worth," she said, "I don't think you failed at anything. I think you're the first person on this station who actually noticed." I did not have a ready response for that, so I let the silence sit between us for a moment, the way I had learned to let silence sit with her, back on the chamber floor, when words would have gotten in the way of something more honest trying to happen. "What's next for you?" I asked, eventually. "After this." "Requested a new posting." She said it lightly, but there was something underneath the lightness, something I recognized now as her actual, unguarded self, rather than the performance of ease she gave most people. Asked for something harder than here, if I'm being honest. This place was good to me, genuinely, but I don't think I know how to just stay still yet. I'm working on it, baby steps. Harder how? There's a survey posting, opening up near a system with unstable tectonic activity, and a couple of predator species nobody's fully cataloged yet. She said this the way someone else might describe a beach vacation, an easy, anticipatory pleasure in her voice that I still, even now, find myself turning over, trying to fully understand. Figured I'd ask if there's anything with worse weather too, see what they've got. I laughed, a real laugh, the kind I had not managed easily in weeks, and Grace smiled back at me, unguarded, entirely present, a woman built by a world that had tried its hardest to end her, and had instead built something that did not know how to stop finding a way through. "Take care of yourself," I told her, and meant every layer that phrase could possibly hold. "You too," she said. "Try resting. I hear it's nice, once you get used to it." I left Halcyon Reach 2 days later with a single case of belongings and a copy of my report saved to a private drive, because I did not entirely trust the official record to survive contact with the political consequences it was about to cause. I was right to be cautious. The review committee took 8 months to issue even a preliminary response, and by the time they did, 3 other stations had independently submitted findings echoing mine, forcing a reckoning the fleet's classification system had apparently needed for far longer than anyone in a position to notice had been willing to admit. I think about Grace more often than I expected to, given how briefly, in the scope of a career, our paths actually crossed. I think about the phrase she used, sitting on a chamber floor with tears sliding down an otherwise composed face. Back home, this would have been a Tuesday. I think about a species that built its resilience not through choice but through necessity, generation after generation, until safety itself became the unfamiliar, disorienting experience, and hardship became the baseline they no longer thought to name. I do not know what happened to Grace after her new posting began. I have not checked, though I have thought about checking more than once, in the quiet months since I left the fleet's employ and returned to independent research on a much smaller, much calmer world of my own. What I do know is this. Somewhere out among the unstable tectonics and uncatalogued predators of her new assignment, there is a woman who was raised by a planet that tried, relentlessly, across every hour of her childhood, to kill her, and who walked away from that planet not broken but built, carrying a baseline of resilience so far beyond anything our instruments were designed to measure, that the very act of testing her, for 900 careful, deliberate hours, turned out to be the closest thing to peace she had ever known. I resigned because I could no longer, in good conscience, sit inside a system that measured danger as though it meant the same thing to every species under its authority. It does not. Some worlds raise their children gently, and gentleness becomes their baseline, and hardship, when it eventually arrives, breaks them the way our models predict it should. And some worlds raise their children the way Grace's world raised her, relentless and unyielding, and entirely without mercy. And what emerges from that kind of childhood is not a person who has learned to survive hardship. It is a person for whom hardship was simply the first language they ever learned to speak, fluently, before they had the words to call it anything else. We did not send Grace Bellamy 900 hours of gravity training to measure her limits. We handed a woman built by a death world 900 hours of rest, and dressed it up as a trial, and called it difficult, and never once stopped to ask her what difficult actually meant. She never broke. We did.